everyone, we're going to talk about urban structure and models to help us understand the structure in urban places. So models seek to look at the arrangement of geographic space, both physical and social or human space, and look at the interactions, the relationships, how they overlap, to come up with a generalized model of urban space. And remember, it's generalized. So we often have problems with these models. They're not 100% accurate for every city because they are generalized. Okay, I've also provided a handout on Blackboard for you that goes over this information that we're covering in the video. On the screen, you see a diagram of the three models covered in your textbook. We're going to talk about these three models today, plus two additional models that I wanted to add to the conversation. So first, what I want to talk to you about is why we model or how we model. What we're doing when we create these models of urban structure is looking at the relationships between physical geographies and human geographies, to look at patterns of growth, to look at how physical geographies and cultural geographies interact with each other, impact each other. But patterns are a big deal because patterns are what we're modeling because they suggest generalizations, right? So here we're going to look at a generalization and a pattern in New Orleans as an example. And when we look at this pattern, it's going to reveal a relationship that is true in many cities across the U.S. So on the left, you see a map of New Orleans that is looking at the elevation of the landscape. So this is a physical geography map. And anything in the blue colors is landscape that's below sea level. So all this land is below sea level. All of this land is below sea level. Much of the land in the city is below sea level. The greens into the reds are above sea level, like the land you see here along the Mississippi River. And it's important to look at this because if you're below sea level, you tend to be more vulnerable to things like flooding events. So that affects the land value and it affects who will live in that space. Because most likely if you can afford to live in a space that's less vulnerable, you probably will. We see that pattern across U.S. cities. So over here on the right, we're looking at a map of poverty. And let's just focus on this neighborhood right here. It's called the Lower Ninth Ward. And we have high poverty rates here in the Lower Ninth Ward. And over here in the physical map, you see that most of it is below sea level in this area here. So it makes sense that you would have a high poverty area. Now this isn't true across New Orleans. There are other factors that impact. For example, this space is below sea level, yet it's not as high poverty here. There are other factors influencing this. So you can't just look at one factor or two factors. You have to look at things in greater detail. But know that, for example, this is a city park. So of course it's not impoverished because nobody's living there, right? So there are other factors that influence that. But that's what we're doing when we're modeling urban space. So the first model we're going to look at, that's covered in your textbook, is concentric zone model developed by Burgess. Burgess used one city, Chicago, studied it intensively to create this model. Of course, basing your model on one city can be problematic, although a lot of the patterns noticed while developing this model is applicable to other cities. So Burgess came up with 5 classes of land use. The CBD, which is in the center of the city, it's considered the core. It has many different types of activities happening here. We have commercial, business, office space. we have residential, we have entertainment, we have green space, right? All sorts of different types of activities happen in the CBD. The next urban class of land use that Burgess noticed, and Burgess suggested that cities grew outward away from the CBD in rings. So the next ring would be the factory area, the industrial area. The next ring being the low income area. And next outward from that is the middle income, and finally the high income. Notice that Burgess called it low class, medium class, and high class. We try not to use that term anymore, although it is used widespread by people. But really it's an income category. So one of the things that Burgess noticed is that low-income people needed to live closer to the CBD because they could not afford transportation to get to work. So that's why this income-based situation is happening. Burgess assumed that high-income people would want to live as far away from the CBD as they possibly could. Of course, we know this isn't always true, but this is a generalization that was made to create this model. Okay. Another assumption that is problematic that Burgess made is that the land is flat. So topography was ignored. And if you have a river running through part of the city, you have a lake, you have a mountain, it will affect the cost of development. So it will absolutely affect where people develop. So that is an example of another assumption that's problematic about this model. Burgess also assumed that transit was equally, equally cheap and efficient in all directions. Again, topography influences that. So that would influence where people settle and how development happens. But for this generalized model, the assumptions were made. Okay, the next model we're going to look at is the sector model created by Hoyt. And Hoyt worked to modify the concentric zone model mainly based on transit routes. Hoyt also studied many more cities to develop this model and discovered that some development was more sector-like in wedges or slices, as you can see in the diagram. So Hoyt clustered development together in these wedges or sectors. For example, let's look at the industrial zone in red here. This wedge is where a railroad might be coming through. And if you look at your handout, you see I penciled in a railroad. And what we know is that next to a railroad, people don't really tend to like to live there because it's noisy. It blocks, when the train's coming through, it blocks you from driving through. You have to sit there and wait. So Hoyt suggested that low-income people would live near those transit routes because land value was lower and they could afford it. Hoyt also included this wedge, for example, for the high-income residential development, showing that people would live closer to the CBD but also farther away. So Hoyt tried to rectify some of these problems through the studies where Hoyt noticed that things were a little different than a perfect concentric circle model. Examples of the sector model include Oneonta, but also Detroit and Calgary, to give you a few examples of these types of cities. Oneonta definitely has an underlying sector model. We have modified that space quite a bit, but if you look at the underlying structure, you can see the sector model very clearly. The third model is the multiple nuclei model, developed by Harris and Ullman. And you can see here in the diagram, there's a lot more detail. a lot more detail than the previous two models, digging in a little more into U.S. cities. So I'd like to point out a couple of things to you. For example, we see that we have some new factory space developing. So the area labeled number 2 is the old industrial space. It tends to be unplanned space. There is very little space for parking because it was developed before the automobile was part of our culture. And buildings tended to be more vertical in nature. The newer industrial parks, shown here by number 6 in that hot pink color, this space tends to be more planned. There's a lot more space for parking because cars were part of the culture when this was developed. And buildings tend to be prefab, one-story. It's very spread out in a horizontal way rather than a vertical way. Harrison Ullman also noticed that there were these places like number 9 here on the outskirts of the city. This is what we call an industrial suburb. Harrison Ullman noticed that these little suburbs were popping up near the new industrial parks so that in particular, women who were working in the factories while their husbands were at war could easily commute to the industrial parks. There are also other suburbs popping up on the outskirts, like represented in number 8 here. And Harrison Ullman noticed these newer shopping centers developing that were closer and more convenient for the high and middle income residential areas. Another thing that Harrison Ullman identified was that each residential area had its own social space, its own community space, or focal point as they called it. So low-income neighborhoods tended to socialize, and they got support from one another at churches. That was their community focal point. Community focal point is a place where you can see, be seen, get support from your community, families interact, all sorts of social interaction. In middle-income areas, they noticed that schools serve that purpose, and in high-income neighborhoods, they noticed that country clubs serve that purpose. Some examples of multiple nuclei model cities in the U.S. include Buffalo, New York, which maybe you're familiar with. Industrialized type cities fit this model. Okay, now I'm going to share with you two models that were not in your textbook, but I think are interesting to go over. First is the Webb model. The Webb model has no diagram. There's no schematic. I can't show you a drawing because it's so different for each city. For each developed space, it's different. But we do see some similarities in the patterns of growth based on these ubiquitous lines in the landscape that nobody notices anymore, like property lines, roadways, utility lines. These types of lines will shape development, and you don't even realize that it's dictating your growth areas, that it's restricting growth. Because when you're looking to develop new land, if there's land that's open along a pre-existing road, it's more likely to happen there than to spend the money to create a new road. Finally, let's talk about the urban realms model. And this model modifies the multiple nuclei model with the understanding that there isn't just one CBD. There isn't just one traditional central business district. There are other centers of activity that happen in outlying areas from the core. The classic example of this urban realms model is Los Angeles because it developed with the automobile largely. And you can see here on this map there are 6 realms, one of which includes the CBD, but there's all these different realms which have their own centers of activity or their own CBDs in a sense. And you may live and work and be entertained in Realm 2, the San Fernando Valley, and never go into the other realms. That has a lot to do with the automobile and that is the urban realms model concept.